you can easily connect him, I think, to listening to Julian of Norwich, not listening, but reading her book of her revelations, her way of looking at things. Now, here is a woman who also lived what we would call a secluded life, but they didn't feel secluded. They felt connected to the world around them in a deep enough fashion. She was what was called an anchoress. She very much saw. Uh, she very much saw that uh, God is in nature, even though she lived in a little hut, if you will, connected to a church. So for people like her and for Thoreau, the natural world was a sacred place. Not only a sacred place, but it was scripture, because God was speaking through nature to do what? To reveal. That's what God does in the Bible for us Christians, and actually for all people of the book, Jews and Muslims, that God is revealing God's self through the Word. Well, Thoreau, like Thomas Berry, who we did study earlier, the natural world is a scripture. It's a revelation of God if you can have a way of looking at it. And so what we find today is, and he saw it there too, is that people would just as soon chop down a tree for its utilitarian value or because it got in the way of something else they wanted to do. So he saw destruction, useless destruction, rather than allowing God's presence. So it would be a little bit like for a Catholic, for someone to walk in and open the tabernacle and take out the host and rip it apart and stomp on it. And that would really upset a Catholic. Well, this tearing down the trees really upset people like Thomas Berry and Henry David Thoreau. So, in a sense, a lot of us say we find God in church buildings and not other places. And I call that the indoor God. A lot of people worship the indoor God, but they don't see the God of creation, who creation has been around a lot longer than than the Catholic Church or Judaism or any religion for that matter. So we need to move away a little bit from living with the indoor God only. He said that he worked just 6 weeks a year. In his 2 years of living at Walden Pond, he worked just six weeks a year in the pencil business. What he was trying to do, I think, in his work, was to free himself up. So he's a bit like St. Anthony of the Desert, if you will. So we kind of keep that in mind. But he felt that nature had a stillness and a solitude to it. But you had to have a kind of interior stillness. Now notice, if you're walking around, you're physically not still. But his kind of walking around, he said, don't have a goal in mind. Stay open. So that was one of the ways that he was sort of available to the God who would reveal God's presence through nature. He didn't say the tree was God, but he said the tree could reveal something of God's presence and life and reality to him. But if you went out saying, I'm going to find a tree that gives me a sense of God's presence, well, that's like saying, I'm going to take a 10-mile run so I'll lose some weight. Well, you may lose some weight, but you might miss something along the 10-mile run that's well worth seeing. So he felt that nature has a stillness and a solitude, We just need to be open to it and perceive that things are. First of all, they just let them be. That things are. And I think the Buddha called it suchness. He might have called it suchness. Things are and not what they are. That's kind of a koan type thing. Things are and they are not what they are. What it's trying to do is wipe in other words, oh, I saw this beautiful flower yesterday. I'm going to go out and look at it again. What you want to do is wipe that out, so to speak, so that the flower might not be the same. A deer might have come along and eaten it. But you're open, so you don't get disappointed. You await some other reality within nature to reveal itself. The flower was just the thing that invited you to go out, sort of like a nice sunny day that we're having up here right now. So it's not what you look at, it's how you see it. So you can take that into your indoor God, into your little holy altar in your home, into your scripture book. It's not that you look at it, because two people can look at something with their eyes, but one person sees and the other does not, because they're seeing from some interior stillness and silence that I think we get in a more still and silent prayer. So it's really, you really have your imagination open to being available to whatever is there. It's how we see things that become, I think, really important. Now, he is also living in a time of what's called the Romantic poets. They were the early 19th century, late 18th century, early 1900s. They call it Romantic poets: Keats, Shelley, Byron. And these people are writing about nature, and they would look at something, or Keats looked at a Greek vase and saw all kinds of things. It's not just it's art. So, for instance, you go into a museum and you look at a piece of art. Two people look at a piece of art, and one sees all kinds of things in it, and the other, says, "Oh, it's nice, it's pretty. I mean, that's good. It's not bad. You're having a good time." But the other person sees all kinds of things. And I don't mean sees as in they understand painting and texture. There's that, but that's a lot of technicality. And I've kind of met people that are good at technicalities, but they don't have any inner eye. You see things in the painting that the artist might have meant you to see. So the artist is inspired. The artist is seeing from a deep place. They're seeing, if you will, with we call the eyes of the divine, the eyes of our Creator. And that's how the painting comes out. That's what makes genius. Not just you paint a hill, you paint a hill, but somebody paints it in a certain way with certain things that certain people are able to see. So it's as if someone was to teach you how to pray in a way that helps you to see the presence within you and around you. Would be the same as, say, a docent in a museum. So these people, these poets, they use the imagination, this sort of their interior selves, and they connect that to the world around them, and then they write about it. So their sense was that nature was more to be admired than used for utilitarian purposes. The Industrial Revolution lost a lot of that, and the 20th century and now the 21st lost a lot of that. But nature was to be admired rather than used. Of course, this is before World War I and II, which just destroyed so much of Europe. So he says, this is why I'm living in the woods. He says, so I can live deliberately. Now, I did say his mom and his sister did his dishes, his laundry, and he would go home to Concord to have a decent meal now and again. But he felt he could live deliberately, that is, according to his own particular calling, and not to someone else's dictates. But it's how he lived in the woods that's important, not just that you live in the woods. I mean, there's survivalists that might live in the woods. He says, what you need to be able to do, and he went to Harvard, by the way, and he knew several languages. He was able to read books in their original language. He knew French, so was able to read a lot of a spiritual literature of my tradition, which had not yet been translated into English. So he could read French. So that's how he had access to a lot. So he wasn't a dumb guy. I mean, he wasn't an uneducated guy. But he says, when you forget learning, that is information, think of the scientific revolution. If you can forget that for a moment, he said, then you begin to know. It's this interior knowledge, to the knowing of the divine, the knowing of the presence, the knowing of what Thomas Keating called ultimate reality, the oneness, non-duality, all these kinds of words. It's a way of knowing, which means he makes a connection with nature that makes him feel a part of it. He's not just viewing it, looking at it. So he's not a pantheist. But nature revealed the face of God. I think Richard Rohr, the Catholic priest Franciscan, might say the same thing. I mean, you look at a holy card. A holy card, in my tradition, we got a lot of holy cards in the Catholic Church. And, some of them, they don't say much to me, but others, they really speak to me. They really do say something. And I said, wow, what grabs me about this card? It reveals something of the face of God, the artist, if you will. So therefore, he's finding God as he's sort of going about. And he's also finding God as he's sitting in his solitude in his little house, which he spent time. In the mornings were given to silence and solitude, if you will, afternoons to his walk, and then he wrote here and there. So God can be found in whatever the present moment is, if you can be available to the present moment. So this God is within us as well as around us. So his walks are what you might call sauntering. He saunters walks. So he's not raising his heart rate. He's not thinking about living forever by his physical exercise, knocking himself out. But he saunters about. And he says sauntering is when you are equally at home everywhere. So think of sauntering in your meditation. So if you sit down to say, I'm going to meditate for a half hour. Oh, okay, God, you got my for a half hour. Come on. No, you're not quite sauntering. I think you're kind of over exercising. So you don't know what's going to happen with God, but you know that God's at work. At the end of your sitting, you might say, I was bored. I was restless. My mind wandered. Okay, that was what you know, but that doesn't mean God wasn't at work, because God can work through everything. So he's equally at home everywhere. And so he says, when you're equally at home everywhere and have no particular home, you are free of worldly engagements. So I think that to me, it's important to have a home, unless you're a missionary, and he's not a missionary in that sense. He's a missionary in the interior, but not going around converting people. But what I think he's saying is what you want to do is be free enough of worldly engagements. And that's what he had. That's what he chose. Now, of course, when you have family and your grandparenting and so on and so forth, you don't have that. But what you can ask yourself is how much do I allow those worldly engagements to engage all my time? Or will I take some sauntering for myself that I think would make you quite available for others? So think of, a lot of people like to read. They like to gather information, especially a 5 on an Enneagram. Information is power. They like to know a lot of stuff. They're big introverts. So out of doors is his library. No, it's not that he didn't read. It's that, but out of doors is his library. That's where he felt he learned a lot. So the emphasis, I think, is getting to be in part on nature. But he wrote about civil disobedience. He wrote against slavery. He wrote against corporations, consumerism, modern anxieties and fears. He wrote about all that stuff. So it is that he found a way, he found a voice to speak to the anxious world through paying attention to his vocation, which for him had a lot to do with nature. So remember now, John the Baptist lived in the wilderness and he ate wild honey and locusts and stuff like that. So we don't see any problem with John the Baptist living in the wilderness because he lived so far away and so long ago. People's problem with Thoreau is he touches your life too closely. And he shows the tremendous difference between the way so many of us live in the modern 21st century and the way Thoreau lived. So he feels that to not know something. So remember, he says race. He said, so ignorance is a negative knowledge. I think the cloud of knowing would agree with this. Versus dogma and theology, which is trying to say, no, 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 we can know, we can know. He says, drop that stuff. If you did, he says, it's negative knowledge. That so-called knowledge, now think of the scientific revolution, think of the age of enlightenment, we're talking about the 19th, 18th century. He says this so-called knowledge is a conceit that we actually know something. And it robs us of a certain ignorance that is sort of having our mind a little bit more blank to be open. So it says, here's the understanding of nature, and then you go out with your head full of stuff, and or someone says, now we're going to do a little meditation, and you say, oh, okay, all right, I'm going to meditate. And all you want to do is think about your theology or your catechism. So it can kind of get in the way, which is why we often suggest in prayer that people don't pay attention to their minds when they want to be full of information, or when your imagination wants to drift off into fantasy land, or you want to think about past or future. The suggestion is not that you don't use your imagination, but you don't pay attention to it when it goes in those directions. I think that's what we're trying to say. So there's a certain amount of ignorance or emptiness of thought, in a sense, or not paying attention to a lot of your information that you learned in school. School is about information when you think about it, but it's not about transformation. And we're hoping that we're more about transformation. There's lots of ways to get information, but sometimes that gets in the way. I'm not saying it always gets in the way, but it can get in the way if you're not, as we say, sauntering, open, trying to stay open, which means you need some space for God to reveal God's self, not through your information, but maybe in some new ways that's you're ready for now. So it's sort of when you forget your school learning for a moment is when you truly begin to know. Now, we often say God is unknowable. Then we spend a lot of time trying to study God. I like the scientists, a lot of them, they say, yeah, we know a lot, but we don't know a lot. And Whereas a lot of institutional religion says, we know a lot, and we know a lot more than you, uh, which just gets into competition, religious competition. So what what we're trying to do, I think, is to reconcile the active and the contemplative, if you would. We're trying to reconcile our lives uh, in the world with a little bit of this thoroughness of being still and silent and waiting upon. We're trying to say, how do we do that? Um, well, one of the ways, I think he suggests it, and he's not the only one. I think the Bhagavad Gita suggests this. One of the ways is to work without attachment to rewards. I think one of the things that makes us very busy is not so much that we're about doing things, but we're about anxiety as to the results of things. We've got anxieties and fears, and those take up a lot of energy. And so we often say, I was exhausted by all I did, but it wasn't the actual physical doing. Sometimes it may be, but it's the exhaustion from the anxiety and the fears, the sense of inadequacy. What will people think about whatever it is that we're doing? I'm going to do something I think in Boulder in June on cooking and contemplation. Uh, so, in other words, two people go into the kitchen to cook, and one does it in a Thoreauness way, and the other does it frantic, frightened. And one, they both cook the meal, and one is completely exhausted, and the other is filled with peace and contentment. Well, what happened? They both worked hard. They both used up physical energy, but one came in it from a different space. So I think that's one of the ways. So it's not just I'm contemplative when I sit for a half hour in my meditation, or when I do a lectio, or when I study a scripture, or take a sauntering walk, and then the rest of the time I'm crazed. Uh, no, it's not like that. So I think we just have to let go of the results. Now I say cooking, I let go of the results. Yeah. Uh, what I mean, it's still going to be food, and sometimes it's going to taste better than other times. I just yesterday I was baking some fish, and there was a grapefruit there. I cut up the grapefruit. I had some of it. I said, "This tastes pretty good. Why don't I pour some grapefruit juice on the fish? Let's try something." I wasn't anxious. It was a disaster. But the guys ate the fish. And to make things even worse, two of them were on medications. Two of the monks said, "Oh, I never do grapefruit on medications because it just sucks up all the medication." And I thought, "Oh, they're both dead men by today." So, but if you've got a little bit of a contemplative life going, if you're sauntering a little bit in your life, it happens. That's the way it goes. So don't use grapefruit on fish. I learned. That I think that's the way it is. It's to say, well, did Thoreau never fall down and trip over a log? I'm sure he did. It's just the way it is. You're looking at a tree, you trip over a stone. Um, but you don't go crazy. You don't go out and say, I'm not going to trip over a stone today. You just be open. So let go of the results. Don't take a walk to get something. Just take a walk. Be open. So some people have a love of action and others a love of contemplation. So that's the struggle. And what we might ask ourselves is to what action is my prayer life leading me? I asked that in the monastery because the image that you might get of a monastery is you're inactive. That is, you're not fixing the world. And well, no, I'm not feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, and clothing the naked. But I would think that I'm of some use, such as now, and that the monastery is kind of a countersign to the world around us and things like that. But it is. what is this leading to? What is my prayer leading to? And so Thoreau had his morning meditation, his afternoon walks, and his pencil business. So if you want to be good for something, why not let it be what you love? Uh, and I think that was him. You want to be good for something, be a good something that you love instead of something that just seems like a terrible burden. Um, you want your vocation to be a way of living a full life. I think Timothy Radcliffe, the Dominican, English Dominican, I think he was head of the whole order for a while, wrote a book recently. And he said that's what salvation is, living life to the full. And that doesn't mean you don't suffer. I mean, Jesus lived life to the full. He was crucified. People didn't like him. They didn't understand him. They reviled him, and so on and so forth. He lived a full life. So think about this in terms of your this struggle, active, contemplative, and think about travel. Well, he didn't say he's not traveling very much. He says, but it's not about travel. It's how alive are you in whatever you do that matters. So first, do things that matter and be alive to them. So that's two things to work at. And so I hope that my spiritual life up here or wherever is am I doing what matters? Now, you can do things that matter, and I'm not saying we do things that don't matter. We can do things that matter, but they're not us. They're not who we are. They're not who God made us to be. We're not living a full life. And a lot of people say, well, I used to do what matters, and now I'm old or something. If you're still around, God has plans. Says, well, I'm in a nursing home or I'm in assisted living or whatever. But God still has plans. There's still something um, for you. It could be writing letters. It could just be the people with whom you live and how you are with them. You know, a lot of people are very lonely. And just the fact that you'd recognize that they exist, that you actually say their name, that can make a big difference in a world that's so impersonal. So he says it's not travel so much. It's how alive are you and what matters? And think about when you do travel, is it to travel? Is it for work? Well, so think of vacations. Often people travel for vacations. I got to get away. And so you ask yourself, from what and why? I get away from doing things I don't like to do. Now, it may be that you have to do some things that you don't like to do. Um, I think Jesus did things he didn't like to do in my tradition. I think I do things that I don't like to do. I mean, it's just part of life. But can we have enough things in our life that do matter so we don't have to so much have a vacation to get away? Uh, but you might ask yourself this when you're doing things. Why are you feeling so busy or why are you feeling so bored that you want to escape it? And that's the question I'll ask myself. I say, oh, Terry, I'm bored. Well, why are you bored? Is it the activity itself or is it something about me in the activity? Am I doing something that absolutely doesn't matter? Or does it matter and I'm just not present enough to it? Uh, See, these are all things that I think are going to come out when we try to slow down enough to connect with that, what I call ultimate reality. That it's not just being present to the presence, it's that it's trying to be open enough to be teachable so that God can reveal things to us. I mean, I believe in a God. A God can reveal things to me that I didn't see before. So people said, how long are you going to be in the monastery? It's like, I don't know. I mean, it's like I got plans for the future. I'd be open to what does God want me to do, which is not the same as saying, I want you here to do something for me. I don't think that's what my life's about, being where you want me to be to do something for you. You got to work on your own stuff to figure out why I need to fix your life. So Thoreau, by the way, Thoreau did ask someone to marry him, and she said no. She probably saw this guy was not going to be the great provider. And but that could have been a terrible destruction to him, and I'm sure it didn't make him happy at the moment. But it opened him up to this life that is so unique, about which he writes and speaks. Uh, so he has this uh, he has this idea. Usually, he calls it a spiritual vision. Parse that. He says, think of your soul. Okay, your interior self. We're not soul, body, two separate things. They're kind of together. This interior life and our physical life, they work together. But think of this interior life. You go, it's soul, and the soul is like a harp. Now, harp's got strings. The strings, that's how you make the sound, the music. The strings are swept by the breath of God so that they chime with the harmonies of creation. So God's not a noisy God. So you got to stop being noisy if you want to listen and hear that voice of God, which is the breath of God, which we speak of the Holy Spirit in my tradition as the breath of God. God breathes on. Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis in the Bible, God breathes into them life. That means they were made they were made with a spiritual entity about them, so that they could chime with the harmonies of God's creation, which was all around them, which is paradise. So in the beginning, we were sort of one with it, not over and against it. So what happens is that I just mentioned body, soul together. The first, he calls it proselyte, the first convert uh, that the soul makes, that is the interior life, is the body. There's a sense in which we will take better care of our bodies if we have a good interior life. I see a lot of people who don't have much of an interior life who beat their bodies up. They go to the gym and they kill themselves. They aerobics themselves. They just do so much over stuff for whatever reason. They read something about they're not going to live forever. So what you stop beating up your body, and actually, you think about the 12-step program of, say, Alcoholics Anonymous, you stop beating up your body with booze because that's a spiritual program. So as you get an interior life, you take better care of your body. That is, you keep things in balance. And your body will reflect this interior life that's going on as you take care of it. You take care of your spiritual parts, if you will. Your physical parts will connect with that, and it's the physicality of yourself that other people see. What they're seeing is a bit of your soul coming through, and they connect with that. And when they connect with you as this physical being, they're connecting with something within. So people will say to you, "You look so peaceful." Well, there's something about your body that looks peaceful. That looks crazed and anxious and frightened and so on and so forth. So people will see that. I've had people say both to me. Yeah, Terry, you look like you're crazy. And then other times you look like you're peaceful. What happened? Well, I guess I was doing things that matter. I was trying to live life more to the full. I was paying attention to my interior self and I was taking care of my body. I mean, those are a couple of things that would bring it out. So, and we can only live healthy. Uh, the life that God, he says, the life that God assigns me is the only one that I can live healthy. Think of genes. sometimes we say, how can that guy live so long? He doesn't really do much exercise, or he does that, blah, blah, blah. Well, genetically, he just is able to get through a lot of things. And other people, they don't have the wherewithal for that. But rather than say, why don't I have what he has or she has? It's the life, it's the body you got, and live it as healthy as you can. And that's just the way it is. Don't think about being 6'4" if you're 5'2". It's what you are. So salvation is really being fully alive. Now, let me go to do a little aside here. I think I'm going to preach on this tomorrow, but many of you are going off to churches or hiking or whatever. Uh, in my tradition, tomorrow is the feast of the Ascension. That means Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, ascends into the heavenly realm, let's say. Well, this body that ascended in my tradition is the same body that was ascended onto the cross. That is, Jesus was raised up by hateful, not caring people and crucified. So he's raised up on the cross. That's pretty miserable experience. But it was after that experience that he rose from the dead, same body, also being raised up, but now with love experienced. Whereas on the cross, it was a sense of abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? Complete suffering. But it was an attempt to be loving in suffering. Now, the night before he gets killed, executed, that's what they did to slaves. Slaves were the ones who were crucified. So they really, really treated him badly. Night before he dies, what does he do? He says, let's eat. That's what Jews do. When things are tough, let's eat. So he takes the bread and shares it, shares the cup with them. This is my body, this is my blood. Well, what's all that about in terms of this death and resurrection? The point of the Eucharist for him, and I think for us, was to give him the strength. Not only did he eat it, but he shared it with others who were going to abandon him, by the way. Cowards, liars, and such. But he called them friends, You do the best you can with what you got. And they're his friends. So he shares, he eats. And he says, do this in remembrance of me. Remembering what? That the Eucharist, in my tradition, is to give us the strength to put up with our cross, to put up with the tough things in our life, the things we cannot get away from, the things that we have to give ourselves to that are suffering. Because if we can go through that, there'll be resurrection and new life. That is, new life doesn't come from avoiding, but from encountering. And the Eucharist is to help us. Now, in my tradition, a lot of people go to Holy Communion and ask God, please prevent any bad things from happening to me. And they never grow. They just stay stuck. They don't want a cross. And if they don't want their cross, they're not going to get their resurrection. That is, you're not going to get the fullness of life. So that's a little bit of a side. But I think it's very important is giving you an example, at least in my tradition, of what it is, why we do what we do. So he says God is still, not still exists, but still as in not moving. And so he says, why don't I be still? If God is still, why don't I be still? A lot of us think, well, God's very active fixing the world. And well, I look around, the world looks like it needs a lot of fixing, and it ain't happening. So Thoreau's idea is God is still, so I want to be still, still within. I don't want to be filled with anxieties and fears and worries about the results of things that I do or don't do. So he says, God is still. I need to find out how to be still. And so I think that's one of the things that I try to practice is doing some stillness, at least try on a daily basis. It's sort of exercising your soul on a regular basis. Now, 1849 was the gold rush, just to keep you in context of his time of living. 1849 is the gold rush. And they're out in California. I think there are other places in the West, I think Oregon, so on and so forth. So he takes this. See, he sees things that are going on. In other words, it's not as if he's not in touch with the world. And he says, and this is after Walden Pond. He says, why don't I? He looks at something out there. So it's like reading the newspaper from within. So he says, why don't I sink a shaft? Remember this, the shaft for gold into the rocks and such. Sink a shaft into myself for the gold that is within me. So in other words, get in touch with the interior life because it's so rich. Discover it, just like these gold rushers. And think of these people who wanted money and how hard they would work and how focused they were. Well, what about being a little focused on a daily basis on your interior life where it's just a mother lode in there, if you will. So he says, there is as much beauty in the local landscape as we are prepared to appreciate. So when I go for a walk in monastery grounds, I have to say, am I prepared to appreciate? I think if I'm in touch with my full self, that is not just my body walking, but yes, my body walking and my soul. Did I do a little stretching before I went? Did I do a little spiritual stretching in meditation? I will maybe appreciate the local landscape. He didn't have to go far. He says, it's all around you. The local landscape, I can appreciate the depth to which I am deep. If there's no inward life, he feels that conversation. Now, he didn't have a lot of conversation at Walden Pond, but he was only there 2 years. He continued his practice of meandering and looking and being open. He says, if you have no inward life, then conversation just becomes gossip. And I thought about that. I says, yeah, sometimes it's only about sports. It's not bad, but we talk about COVID or masks, or we talk about work, but it's only with good friends that you get a little bit deeper. Why? Because you're opening yourself to them because you feel a connection with them. Open yourself to God and you'll see. And then as things are revealed to you by God, you'll be more open to reveal them to others, whether you appreciate it or not. I mean, the tree reveals the presence of God, but not everybody sees it. But that doesn't, the tree's okay with that. It's still there. So, whereas Calvinism, or the branch of it that came on, says, be busy, make good, do well. And it shows that if you do well and make your fortunes, that God's smiling on you. Well, he didn't buy that. He said, just employ yourself enough so you can watch the progress of the seasons. I mean, don't miss out on the change of seasons. If you have change of seasons, and we do up here, some places there's not a whole lot of change of seasons, Florida, but so he thinks about his wants. He says, I'm trying to dampen my wants. If my wants get too much increased, I'll have to work harder. Here's the quote. He says, if my wants should be too much increased, the labor required to supply them would become a drudgery, and I would neglect my peculiar calling. And this is kind of really succinctly what I've been talking about, is sometimes our frenzy and anxiety is to make what we need to make to satisfy the wants that we want. He says, dampen down your wants, want less. So I find myself now, I'm going to go back to Boulder for a week or so, the end of June, do a little teaching there. unless, of course, COVID is a mess. Maybe no one will show up. Um, and I'm really going to downsize a lot of my stuff. I have more stuff than I need. Give it to somebody else who doesn't have stuff, and just simplify my life so that just make it simpler. Make my life simple up here, simple down there. You notice behind me, I got this hat rack. I'm a hat collector. I said, do I need all those hats? I said, yes, I need all those hats. I got to give away a few hats. I got hats everywhere. I got shoes everywhere. Oh my gosh. So I don't want to neglect my peculiar calling by working so hard to satisfy these wants that came from consumerism. And then he says, okay, so you're going to criticize me? Criticize me for being what I am. I will be even more so. So if you really have a sense of who you are, then you don't mind people criticizing you. People say, you shouldn't be in that monastery. You should be, and then they name something that I should be doing that they think is not my calling. So it's what you think I should be doing or somebody should be doing, but I don't feel it's my calling. If God reveals it, then I do it. But I'm just trying to be who God made me to be at this point in my life so that I can be prepared and ready for what he wants me to do next. I mean, you can't go from the number 1 to 3 without going through 2. Think of it that way. It's life is sequential, if you will, in spiritual growth. So I don't want to pass through the monastery whatever time I'm here. I want to immerse myself in the monastery. So I'm not looking for a lot of travel. So he feels that he feels this about his profession. Always be alert to find God in nature. So think of that as part of your profession. Now, maybe for him it was nature. Always be alert to find God. It's open to find God where, in what. Uh, so often, when I'm about to undertake a task, I bless myself first. This is something we do in my Catholic tradition. I bless myself first, and I ask God, may I do your will. May I be open to whatever you wanted me to be revealed. And then I cook, or I bake, or I clean, or whatever, or I read. So I want to be alert to find God in what I'm doing. So you got to ask yourself, do you find God in your work? Well, some people say, I'm old. Well, that's your work. Your work is these wisdom years, the years of aging, or as Salman Shachter said, saging. You're saging if you stop feeling sorry for yourself, which I have to work on, by the way. So grandparenting, aging, they're all opportunities to find God. Then now, you see, he takes this very practically into the economic world. He said robbery and thievery happen in communities where some have got more than is sufficient and others not enough. Now, he's living in the time when Marx and Engels are writing Communist Manifesto and so on and so forth. I think Karl Marx was living in England when he did this. And they're writing about the economic inequalities. Well, we have that today. So it's not as if Thoreau is not speaking to the modern world. I think he is. That's the only reason I'm talking about him. I'm not doing a history lesson on the 19th century. So he feels a lot of robbery and thievery happens in communities because some have too much and some don't have enough. It's something to think about. But what I think is important in this, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, is that his spiritual life led him to look at the world around him beyond the woods and to see. So what he's seeing in people is the face of God, all people, poor as well as the rich, and he's speaking to that. So if your spiritual life is true, you don't have to worry about being disconnected from the suffering in the world. You may speak to it from the perspective of being who you are. You have to speak with your voice, not somebody else's voice. See, that's what school does. School gives you information and then you repeat the information. It's somebody else's words that you say. What is your words? So you can read what you learn in school, but then bring it through yourself and see what's what in you, because some things will be more important to you and some things will be less important to you. That doesn't mean that they're less important, period. It meant you're not needed to talk about those. Someone else can talk about those. You talk about your stuff. You talk about what God has revealed to you. God wants your voice to speak about this issue, not that issue. So, again, be yourself. Uh, if it were liberation theology, it would be just live simply. That's the solution in life. Live more simply. So I'm trying to live more simply and giving away stuff. So he says he eats simply so he doesn't have to work hard to eat hard. And I think we eat simply here. We don't really have meat much at all. And so it's simple in a way. I mean, it's good. It's good food. I mean, I cook good. Well, I cook well. Excuse me. The nun who taught me English, she turned me over in a grave. So he says, as for conforming outwardly, let's talk about that. And living your own life inwardly, he didn't think much of that. He says it's pulling in two directions. That's what I did for too long. Uh, I'm going to one way outwardly, and that, but okay, I'll do this outwardly, but I got to have my life inwardly. I'm over that. Uh, it's not your own life inwardly. You live your own life. It's the life God gave you in the body God gave me. I don't want to pull in two directions. Now, we are getting towards 10 o'clock, and I think we might need to take a bit of a break. And after that, I'm going to do some quotes from him, but we also have 20 minutes. So, what we'll do is Chris will take over in a second. We're going to take a break, I think, for 10 minutes. After that break, we're going to do a 20-minute sit. Then we'll be open to Q&A. And I will give some his great quotes while you're thinking up your questions. Okay, Chris?
All right, yeah, we'll come back at 10:10. So it'll be about a 13-minute break. And on the screen while we're breaking, I'll have, this is sponsored by the Paulist Ministry of Father Terry Ryan. And I have ways you can make a donation. This is totally free, but if you want to make a donation, definitely. And then also I will have the topic for his June retreats on the first Saturday and the third Saturday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. We'll be back at 10:10.
Oh, here we are. Welcome back to everybody. Um, we're going to do a little contemplative sit here for 20 minutes. Um, get my timer all set. Now, interesting enough, people say, what am I supposed to do for this 20 minutes? What is all this sitting about? Um, there are various different methods that people use. I'm going to mention something. We often hear people say, uh, don't pay attention to your thoughts, to your imagination, and so on and so forth. Don't pay attention to your emotions or whatever. Just, but that may work for some people, and if it does, they'll soon find out that it really works for them. It's kind of called the apophatic tradition. But for some people, they really need to pay attention to their imaginations. Their imaginations are the way that they get in touch. It looks like Thoreau did that. Uh, I think when we talk about detachment, what we mean is take the imagination, for instance. What you want to do is to have a method of prayer so that when you find yourself in fantasy land, that's the imagination. You just do something like notice your breath or have a word to remind you that you're not about fantasy land. As opposed to the imagination being used by God to reveal something of God's self in the now moment, the be here now moment. Uh, and the same with the mind. If you find yourself thinking about the past, the future, trying to solve a problem, uh, that's when you call upon some device like your breath or a word, just to remind you, you're not here to think about the past or the future or to solve a problem. You're here to leave your mind open for God to fill. So after a while, you just get the sense of those things because people say, "Well, I had the sense of the presence of God." Well, that could be from the imagination, from feelings, or so. What we try to do is stay detached from stuff that's not helpful to being in the present moment. All those things that are just about escape from being in me here now. So that's what we're going to try for 20 minutes. And what I do is I just pay attention to my breath when I find myself drifting off someplace. Okie doke, we got to start now. 20 minutes of stillness and silence. Okay, when you're ready, just open your eyes and we'll get back to it. Those who are still here. Oh, we have 19 people still here. Oh my gosh. Now, this is recorded, by the way. And so you can get it by going on snowmassbookstore.com. And it'll be listed there. Give it a day or so for us to get it on. It'll be listed there as a YouTube, but you don't have to go onto YouTube to find it. It'll say, here's where it is on YouTube. You just hit that and it'll take you to YouTube. So keep that in mind. And we had something up there about a sadhu. Sadhu is kind of a traveling fellow, wisdom figure, monk, beggar. And this sadhu's name was Sundar Singh. He actually, so he was a Hindu and he had a religious experience of Jesus, let's say, and he made a conversion. And then he spoke about, very much into faith. So what we're thinking of doing this summer is having a few talks on a couple of Saturdays, sort of mystical interfaith travel. So instead of traveling to other parts of the world, we'll talk about other parts of the world. And Sundar will be the first one we'll look at the first two times. So that'll be June, I think, 5th and 19th, those two Saturdays. But we're going to start at 10 o'clock instead of 9. So one of the reasons is people might, being it hotter, people like to get a lot of things done early in the morning. And we'll just go from 10 to close to 11, take a short break, and then any Q&A, and that'll be it for the day. So it'll be start later, but it'll be briefer. And then I'm thinking of teaching in person at Sacred Heart of Jesus in Boulder on Saturday, June 26th on cooking and contemplation. There's several things to work out, but at least we have the hall. We don't know what the protocols will be for mask and not mask, how safe it'll be. I'm still trying to find out if we have Zoom, that is internet there, because I want to record it. And so it could be me sitting in the hall by myself recording. It's okay, I'll wear a mask, whatever. So we're thinking of, so keep that in mind if you're in Boulder. Could be fun, cooking and contemplation. So those are the things that I wanted to mention. And now let's see for questions. And then I see, well, there's 3 things in chat. Let's see what they had. Your mention of detachment from the imagination was helpful, unlike in discursive meditation in the Jesuit tradition where we actively engage the imagination. So there is a time in prayer to actively engage the imagination, but not during centering prayer, not during Thoreau saunters. Thanks for you, Father. The first 3, there's kind of a 4-part thing to the Jesuit tradition. And the third part is not contemplative. So that actively engage in the imagination. As you move more into contemplative, you don't want to pay attention to the imagination trying to figure things out, as you might in reading scripture or doing lectio. You want to let it rest, but you don't have to kill it. Because God, you may be a kind of person who prays that God wants to speak through your imagination. Well, how will you know? Well, I think you better practice, and over a period of time, it'll become apparent to you. Centering prayer people don't even pay attention to that. You just figure out which is the one that works for you. If anybody says this is the only way to contemplate, forget it. They know their way. Now, let's see. Do we have any other thingies? You can always just unmute and ask me a question. But I'm going to quote some of the more famous or less famous sayings that actually came from Thoreau, from all that he did. He said, the mass of people, he said men, but we'll update it. The mass of people lead lives of quiet desperation. we hear that often. He was the one who came up with that. People lead lives of quiet desperation. That is, they're desperate and they're not saying anything. And I think one of the things that comes out of a more contemplative life, that is, not paying so much attention to yourself, but being open, is that you learn to pay attention to other people, not to necessarily what they say, but the manner in which they present themselves. Remember, the body and soul are together, as I said. And so their physicality will reveal something if we can be attuned to it. But if we're always in touch with just ourselves or trying to think of an answer to something they say or trying to just get by them because we're busy doing our own thing, we'll never notice these moments of quiet desperation. He said this is the mid 19th century that he's saying this. Then another thing he says, I think will please most Republicans, is government is best which governs least. That is, he doesn't really want it to be in the way. And other people have taken that quote. I thought it was other people who had made it up, but that was, well, at least there was one that he was very much in touch with. And here's another one he said, if a person does not keep pace with their companions, perhaps it's because they hear a different drummer. Let that person step to the music which they hear. So we have to listen to the beat of our own drummer, if you will. We hear a different drummer. So I'm not saying everybody should be in a monastery. I'm not saying anybody should be in a monastery. I just know this is the place for me now. This is the drummer that I'm hearing. And you're hearing a different drummer. Don't try to get me to hear your drummer. It's not my drummer. And I do the same for other people. I simply suggest the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are suggestions. You can't tell a lot of people what to do. So I simply make suggestions. You might find this way of praying. You might try centering prayer. You might like it. You might try the Jesuit Ignatian method. You might like it. Here's some things. Why don't you try them and see what moves you? So here's a couple of other quotes. Why feel lonely? Is not our planet in the Milky Way? I just went out and looked at the stars this morning, so this one hits me. I'm never alone. I'm part of this vast universe. He said, our little planet, we call it, it's part of something bigger than ourselves. But so there's a lot going on. We're all interconnected, so we're never really alone, but we can feel lonely. That's a feeling. I'm not saying to say deny it, but just say, what can I do to deal with my lonely feeling? Can I see things in a little bit different way? So continuing with the Milky Way idea, says next to us is the workman whose work we are. In other words, we're God's work. We're Mother Nature's work. That the universe is at work and we're part of this. Some star blew up 1 billion years ago, many billion years ago, and the materials that came out of that from chemical, physical reactions and physics and all came to form our sun and our planet, so on and so forth. We're part of something larger than ourselves. So in a sense, we're never really alone. He says that solitude is not measured by miles of space. So solitude is, let me parse that a little bit. Solitude is not about being alone and having people far away from you so they don't bug you. You can be in solitude on a bus, but you have to have a consistent ability to get in touch with your interior life. He said, a fault finder will find fault even in paradise. So the idea that you find fault with everybody in the world, and when you die and go to heaven, it'll be peaceful. He says, nah, you'll find fault in paradise because you're a fault finder. You're a judgmental person. You want everybody to go to listen to the beat of your drum, if you will. And he says that humility is like a darkness that reveals the heavenly lights. This is very much in centering prayer tradition, very much John of the Cross. Humility is like a darkness. If you be humble enough to get out of your own way, not make yourself the center of the universe, and maybe there will be a darkness in your prayer, and you'll say, I'm bored, or I don't see anything. But but the heavenly lights are revealed through the darkness. I think it says it in the Bible. There was dark, the light overcame the darkness. There is darkness, but the light overcomes it. What did I say before about Jesus is raised on the cross? He's also raised in the resurrection. Same body, different experience. So the light is revealed through the darkness. A lot of us pray, I don't want any darkness, God. Get darkness away. Well, then you don't want to grow spiritually. He says, oh, here's one definitely for the 21st century. He says, I don't want to live in this restless, nervous, bustling, trivial 19th century. My gosh. And we think, wasn't life so simple back then in the 1840s? It must have been so simple. Not so many people, and not so many problems. He said, no. It was restless, nervous, bustling, and trivial. 19th century. He says, but stand or sit thoughtfully while it goes by. So you don't always have to be about fixing things. Sometimes you just need to sit thoughtfully and let things pass by. Only that day dawns to which we are awake. And boy, do I feel that in my life. I get up in the morning, and if I'm full of stuff, the day never dawns for me. I can go out and look at the stars, and the day is dawning. I can take a look at the fog sitting over the fields. The day is dawning. In other words, be in touch with the way the sun is, or the clouds, or whatever. And you just got to get awake to what's right in front of your eyes and stop living inside your little head with all your problems and such. Okay, to ask a question, please unmute and ask Father Terry a question, or you can use the chat function to ask your question. Well, I already brought that up. I see Rosalie Gansecki is here. She's a big centering prayer person. I see her smiling. Now, and there are, many others. There's Sandra. Mary Kendall. Oh, yeah, well, it's good to see all you people. Michael. And my sister Jane is on. Oh, my gosh. She's busy with a garden. And I know that my dentist was on someplace. My other sister in Florida, Elizabeth. She's also on. Oh, both sisters there. I hope I didn't say anything bad about our family. Any case, I'll hear about it. Thank you all for joining. And we're going to be back again on the first Saturday. So you SOS people, you'll be finished your whatever you're doing, book club stuff by noon in the East Coast. So you can tune in. So it's 10 o'clock Mountain Time for just an hour or so. And it's on international travels with contemplative mystics. And the first one's a Hindu who converted, and how he does interfaith stuff. So, and this is going to be, this is recorded now. It's being recorded. It's going to be on snowmassbookstore.com. So you can catch it then if your friends didn't catch it. And you can support me, keep me out of debtor's prison. Maybe I'll see you in Boulder on the 26th. The Boulder people, see how it is. Bring a mask if you want, whatever. We'll see what's going to happen. Cooking and contemplation. So thank you all for being here. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Father Terry.
Thank you. God bless.
God bless you all. I know.